for 20.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Indiana University Center for Cultural Affairs workshop. We're glad to see so many people tuning in today, and we have a great session coming up. My colleague, Dr. Joanna Woronkowicz, who, if you've been coming to these sessions at all, you already know, is writing a book. I think it's fair to say this is still a work in not quite finished yet. It is still in progress, but I have had the good fortune to be offered the chance to read a full draft of this really interesting book, Being an Artist in America: How Artists Build Careers and What Society Can Do to Support Them. It's just terrific stuff, full of insights into careers of artists, both their education and labor market outcomes, and all of the myriad of policy questions that come up. So when this is available to all, I know that this is something that everybody will want to have on their shelf, and I'm certainly looking forward to that. Our format today is going to be, I'm going to, for the first half hour, present some questions to Joanna based on my reading of her book, just to give a sense of what's there. And then we'll turn to a question and answer from all of you out in Zoom land. You are free to put questions into the chat if you want, but because I am absolutely incapable of multitasking, you should know that it won't be until I have finished my questions with Joanna that I'll actually have a chance to look at that, but I will try to catch up later. So if something occurs to you in the middle of my questions, do put it in the chat, but just realize I'm not ignoring you. I'll just get to it later on. All right, so we'll get started. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joanna. And I'm just going to put my first question on Being an Artist in America. When you propose a book to a publisher, the first thing they always ask you is, well, what's new here? Like, what makes this a different book? What can you tell us about Being an Artist in America?
Good first question. So, hi, everyone. It's nice to be, by the way, in this seat being asked questions instead of asking the questions. And I enjoy being able to say things about something that I've been working on now for several years, that I've been working on by myself and was able to share for the first time with my colleague and friend, Michael. So very excited to talk about it a little bit today. So, you know, I had thought about this a lot because I thought about writing this book a long time ago, probably when I was doing my PhD, and worked on a number of different projects, and then eventually got sidetracked, worked on something else, and came back to this. But this has always been my love, thinking about how artists build careers. And I always wanted to think about what is it that I can bring to this space that is unique from what others have already written, because as you know, you'll read throughout the book when it's released, there is a lot on artist labor markets. We actually do know a lot, and there's a good deal of very, very good studies on how artists build careers, which I wish actually were more paid attention to than they are. However, I think I kind of bring I make three contributions with this book. The first contribution is it is a book that is, let's see. So it's a blend between, I think, what the academic literature currently says about artists and how they approach the understanding of artistic work, and how perhaps some of the books we've read in the popular press have approached artistic work and described how artists build careers. In my opinion, I think that the popular press literature, so for example, we have like William Dershowitz's Death of the Artist and Scott Timberg's Culture Crash. These books are really apocalyptic, right? So they present artists as being constantly sort of attacked by these external forces. These could be technology, these could be changes in labor markets, change in public perception of artists, but basically that the artistic sector, the artistic workforce is just being decimated by these external forces. And I don't take that perspective, but I think there's a little bit of a blend here between that perspective and what I see the academic perspective being, in that the academic literature really, it doesn't judge, in my opinion, of what is possibly impacting the on how artists build careers, but it's more of an analysis, right? As academic literature is, it's an empirical analysis of how artists actually do the things that they do. What are the rates of, self-employment, these types of factual things, then providing some kind of ultimate conclusion about how we see artists navigate the labor market. I think I take a blend between these two types, these two literatures, on it, not only in terms of perspective, but also I think in terms of readability. My book is actually, it's an academic book, but I hope that it's quite readable. And also, my book has, it's realistic, but it's also logical, and that I think I provide a little bit of a formula almost for if you want to be an artist, here's the way that it works. And so I am not at all idealist in if you want to be an artist, you're going to do it if you just do these 10 things. So I do obviously recognize that there are these external factors that come into play that make it really hard to be able to be an artist. But at the same time, I'm really quite logical about it. I use data, I use evidence. I say, here's what we see about the artists who who have bachelor's degrees in the arts versus those who don't, in terms of their ultimate returns on income. And for example, how long they persist in these careers. So I use evidence, I use data, and I want to say I kind of give a little bit of a formula, but the formula is not exactly, clear in that if you follow the formula, you're going to be an artist. And then finally, I think the other thing I do in this book is I give you a guide. And so I give a guide for policy. So a lot of this book is about policy, and I don't think a lot of books do that. I think they present the situation and then say, here's the problem. But I think what we're lacking in a lot of the other books and literature is solutions, and I provide solutions in this book.
Okay, that's great. So let me get into some of the meat of the book and how you analyze this. And so, one question is, we're talking about artists, but there's all kinds of artists, right? There's opera singers and jazz guitarists and actors and painters and ballet dancers. They're all artists, but it would seem to me they face very different worlds. And so when you write about being an artist in America, how do you handle the fact that there seem to be just all these differences across them? I like to play guitar with friends after work. Some of them are even on this call right now. Do I count in this picture as well? So how do you deal with this, really diverse collection of people and what they do?
It's the number one question people ask me when I talk about this book is, well, how do you define the artist? And it's the number one question that we ask in different policy circles and conversations about how to support artists is, well, who's an artist? And obviously this is a really hard question to answer, but the way that I approach it in a book, and honestly in most of my work on artists, is that the definition of an artist depends on the reason that you're defining it. So there is, in my opinion, no one definition of an artist. There is the definition that grant makers use in order to give grants to artists who are doing artistic work. So there's one definition. It's somebody who is engaging in artistic work or has a portfolio to submit in order to be able to be eligible for funding. That's one definition. There are other definitions that depend on self-identification. So, Michael, I wouldn't call you an artist for the purpose of my book, but maybe you call yourself an artist, and I'm not going to argue with that. There are a lot of people who I would call artists who maybe don't even think that they're artists. So I think there can be there's a multitude of definitions. So I really focus on the definition of an artist for the purpose of writing this book, which is to talk about policy. And so my interest is understanding how artistic work is created And in doing so, I identify people who work in artistic careers and therefore produce artistic work. And that is, for me, important because ultimately what I'm trying to do is think about how policy can stimulate the artistic market so that we can see better quality and more artistic work. I think those two things kind of go hand in hand, and you can, argue what's more important, but quality and quantity. So for my purpose, I have a very strict definition, but it's because of what I'm trying to do. Now, in terms of, that there are lots of different types of artistic work being produced, you have to be really careful about obviously making statements that don't apply to everybody. So I'm pretty careful, I think, in this book to try to focus on the things that are relatively consistent across different types of artists. And then I think, very careful in the book about pointing out when they're not. So, for example, I talk about whether or not talent or education makes more of a difference in the ultimate sustainability of an artistic career. And that is an area that there's relatively consistent evidence that the two things are complements to one another. One doesn't matter more than the other, but they both matter together a lot. So in that respect, I don't think that there are a lot of reasons to say, okay, a ballet dancer is different than an actor, then it's different than an opera singer. But then there are parts of the book that I do think that it's important to point out. So for example, I talk a lot about contingent work and non-standard work among artists. And while we know that approximately 35% of the artistic workforce is self-employed, that number varies across different types of artists. And the proportion of people who hold multiple jobs and work part-time varies among different types of artists. So for example, actors, they are more likely than a lot of than designers to hold part-time jobs. And so I make a point in identifying the different types of artists there. But I try to be really careful about making these broad points that apply to everyone in my group that I define early on in the book, and then being very careful about identifying when there are important and distinct differences.
Okay, thanks. So let me start asking about some of these policy questions. You stressed that that policy is going to be important here, and a number of them came up through the book. And why don't we start with school, since we've talked about higher education, and there's a number of studies, including all the SNAP studies on the impact of higher education. So we know that there's a policy question on higher education. There's big externalities from human capital accumulation. There's terribly imperfect capital markets for students to finance their education. And so we have a number of policy interventions. When it comes to higher education policy, is training in the arts different from how we would handle, say, policy around higher education for occupational therapists or accountants or elementary school teachers?
Yeah, really good question. And I will say yes and no. So yes, there are a lot of similarities in the policy problems that we see among the artistic workforce related to higher education, as we do for other occupations. So for example, the issue of debt and having so much debt that you're not able to pay back the debt. And obviously it's affecting other parts of your life, right? So in that respect, no, artists in higher education are no different than many other students who take on debt in order to build a career. But there are also big differences, I think, and this is based on the data, based on the evidence we have. We know that there are and the SNAP data tell us this, the Census Bureau data tell us this. We know that there are a lot of artists who have a significant amount of student loan debt. And for these artists, we're also seeing that having a significant amount of student loan debt is affecting whether or not people are entering into artistic careers, and then a variety of other types of financial issues in their lives. And so we know that this issue is exacerbated among artists. We also know that art schools are actually quite expensive. Art programs in universities on average degree programs cost more than many other types of programs. And proportionally speaking, the students coming out of those programs are coming out with disproportionately greater levels of debt. And yet we also know that it's really hard to survive as an artist financially. So given that risk-reward ratio, I think this is, yes, a unique policy problem to the artistic workforce that we should, as a sector, the arts sector, think about. But at the same time, it's very, very similar to what many other workforces are also dealing with in terms of graduates of higher ed. So I will say that a large thread of the book is about how artist policy shouldn't be thought about in isolation, and how artist policy is often a small part of broader level policies that would make an influence, also would have an influence on artists' lives and artists' careers, such as, for example, policy around debt and higher ed, such as, for example, policy around housing, for example, policy around the gig economy. So I try to make the argument in the book that we don't need to be reinventing the wheel in a lot of these circumstances when we're thinking about artist policy. The policy is there, but we need to be thinking about how to integrate within these larger, broader policy conversations.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's now take our student who's graduated from university to work. One of the things that makes being an artist different from being an occupational therapist or an accountant or an elementary school teacher is the distribution of wages. And I think everybody on this call knows it's very skewed in the arts in terms of sort of a so-called superstar economy, where your average wage is fairly different from the median wage in that sense. That raises two things. One is just a fairly wonky sort of data problem. How do you analyze labor market outcomes when you simply don't have normal distributions out there? And secondly, does that skewness in earnings present its own particular policy problems that we don't find in other occupations?
So, to the first question, the way I deal with that is that I'm really careful in the book not to present the data. So if I'm ever using average income, which I think I do once or twice, I don't talk about or discuss that statistic as a reliable statistic for what the average artist will make in their career. Instead, I use that data point to compare to something else, right? So, for example, artists who have degrees versus artists who don't have degrees. I look at their income over time and see who makes more, and I compare between these two figures, but I never say in the book, this is what you can reliably expect to have as an income if you get a degree in the arts or not in the arts. So I think I'm just cautious there. And then from a data standpoint, you remove your outliers, you remove your Bill Gates, for example, if you're ever dealing with that. So I think the second question you have is it a problem that we have this superstar effect? Is it a problem that a lot of people make a lot of money in the arts and that a lot of people don't? So I actually don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's a problem that in any occupation, some people make a lot of money and other people don't, right? Now, that being said, for the artistic sector, there's a problem in that there are a lot of people who are hardly making any money, and then they're having all sorts of other problems. So they can't afford to pay rent. They're using other forms of public welfare. That's the policy problem I see. So it's not necessarily that people are making a lot and other people are making very little, but it's the unintended consequences of that type of wage distribution. So I'm not saying that the solution here is just to pay everyone and a lot, right? But I am saying in the book that it's generally not very good for society to have a lot of people not doing very well. So we, as a policy issue, I do think that that is one to pay attention to.
Okay. One of the things you've mentioned a few times here is artists working in the gig economy. Now, that's a new name for something we've actually had for a long time. I mean, since the demise of the studio system, many people working in film productions are in a gig economy. Actors are in a gig economy. Does it present particular issues? The fact that sort of a higher proportion of artists are in a different situation from, say, people who just go to work at say, an ordinary firm and stay there through their career on a full-time basis.
Yeah. No, I don't think it is. And the reason I don't think it is because artistic work lends itself to gig style work. And I see that in the data. We know that as there is sometimes not a set schedule for creativity. I mean, we probably know this in our own jobs. And so the nature of artistic work is such that there sometimes needs to be jobs that are in sort of this gig style. But again, I think related to your wage question, the wage distribution question, it's the extension of the gig style work and the prevalence of gig style work among the artist workforce that becomes, in a sense, of the policy problem, right? So there are a lot of gig workers who are not only struggling to make ends meet, right, but not receiving the same type of social benefits that we have when we have our social benefits tied to employment. So that is an unintended consequence, I believe, of the nature of artistic work. And again, an opportunity to sort of integrate the artist policy into a broader policy discussion. So yeah, so I think it's the same kind of answer I gave you before, but no, I don't think it is. In general, I think I take this approach in the book, and I take this approach with just understanding artistic work, that it is what it is, right? It's the process of creating an artistic work happens in a certain manner, and it's nothing we can change, but we can think about what are all of the unintended consequences of how that work gets created in the society and the policy system that we have set up for work today.
Okay, I think that when I got to the conclusion of your book, this was the big sort of if there was one big message I got from the book on policy towards artist careers, it was this. And this may be sort of a lengthier question, but you see a lot of arts advocacy out there that really tries to stress the fact that, hey, artists are workers. Artists are workers, and they earn income, they produce value, they're a part of the economy. These are real jobs, I think was one campaign they had. And economist me says, well, sure, okay, so what? Lots of people have, are real workers with real jobs producing things of real value. So all you're saying is that artists are just like everybody else in the workforce. So a question then becomes, well, why would we need special policy for the arts if, in fact, artists are just workers like plumbers and electricians and accountants and everybody else? And I think, tell me if I've got this right, but a message of your book is not that policy needs to do sort of more for artists, give them benefits that other workers don't have, but to give sort of comparable support, which may mean special policies around the arts, not to give sort of extra special benefits to artists because they're extra special people, but simply to bring some sort of equity in terms of how people are able to make a living and able to get on. Have I got that right?
Yes. So thanks for reading the book. Thanks for interpreting it correctly. And I'm going to put myself a pat on the back for perhaps writing it in a way that you're getting what I'm trying to say. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think what you got from my book was what I think I was trying to say. So the approach I take, and I start off right in the beginning of the book with this approach, is that artists aren't special. And I think that's actually sometimes, and maybe I'm going to say artists aren't exceptional. I use that term a lot in the book to try to make my argument. There's nothing exceptional about this workforce. We might think so, but in terms of policy and how policy should how policy can be designed to support this workforce, we have to, I think, in my opinion, stop talking about the arts and artists as exceptional and start talking about them more so as any other type of worker. And so the way I try to make this argument in the book is that I try to say the value of an artist is not in terms of their how exceptional they are, but the value of an artist is in their right to choose an occupation, which might sound pretty simple, but if you think about it, it's the right that everyone has, regardless of what occupation that they'd like to choose. And I don't think anybody would really argue with that, because if you argue against that everyone should have the right to choose an occupation, right? A lot of really bad things, you can think about a lot of really bad things that can happen if you don't give everybody that right. But you can also think about a lot of really good things that happen if you give everybody that right, which is, for example, people are able to identify and use their innate talents, and we're able to see these innovations and really great things happen in industries that in industries and with our products and services. So if we present artists in this way as any other worker with the right to choose their own occupation, and we stop arguing in terms of artists are exceptional because of their instrumental values, right? I think there could be some real progress for this workforce, especially in terms of policy. Now, one thing that you also talked about was the approach perhaps I take in this book of recommending sort of special policy measures. And they're not special in that they're treating artists special in the argument that I just made, but they're special in that they are actually responding to the way that artists work. The whole book is about understanding how artists build careers, the intricacies of it, the details of it, and then thinking about what kinds of common sense policies can respond to the way that artistic work gets produced. And so, for example, we see that artists are coming out of university arts programs with a lot of debt and not being able to find artistic jobs. So we should really think about policy surrounding higher education institutions and the ability of universities to charge massive amounts of tuition and also allow students to take on massive amounts of debt, primarily the latter piece, right? So there's a policy that's reacting specifically to what we know about how artists are trying to build their careers. So I think that's the approach I take in the book. Is it's not these are not special policies in that they're treating artists in a special way. They're actually saying, let's take the exceptional out of how we think about artists and let's make our policies more tailored. In other words, let's create the right policies that actually do something to push this workforce forward.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last question. We've spoken a lot to policymakers, and there's a number of policymakers on this call. Now let's ask a question on behalf of the artist. And so here's my question. So let's think about Amy. And Amy is a junior at Bloomington High School North, and she has a talent in drawing and painting. Not superstar talent, but her teachers and her fellow students and family all say, wow, you're really good at this. You're really good at drawing and painting. And Amy is thinking of going to art school. She's thinking, she doesn't have a lot of money, so she'll probably go to a public university and see if she can get a BFA. But she's not sure. She's not sure about what the future would hold if she did that. Her other friends are going into, business or computer programming or, education or public health. What do you say to Amy? She knows that you've written this book and she says, can you tell me anything about what it's like trying to make a living as an artist? Because I'm really not sure. What do you say to Amy?
Such an interesting question, because as you know, I have 3 kids and they're all really little, but I think about every day, what if one of them comes to me and says they want to be an artist? And as background, I went to my parents and said, I want to be a musical theater actor. And they were really happy. They said, go for it. They said, go and do it. We love it. You've been doing this your entire life. And then when I chose to not be a musical theater actor and chose to be an economist, they were really disappointed. So I don't know if that would be my response. But what I would say to Amy is, Amy, you have a lot of things to consider, right? Amy, so you have some talent. You could probably complement that talent with some training in drawing and painting if you went to a BFA program, and then you could have a shot at making a career as an artist. So everybody can do that. No, right? Everybody has that right to do that. But there's a lot of risk. And so Amy needs to think about what happens if that doesn't work out. And so maybe Amy comes from a family where somebody set up, Amy has a trust fund, right? And so Amy doesn't really need to worry about if it doesn't work out. So she can go ahead and she can try it. And if she doesn't end up being able to do it or doesn't want to do it, which is more the case, people just sort of exit out of the labor market exit from the artistic workforce because they don't want to do it anymore. They don't want to try. That's what I did. She doesn't really have to worry financially, right? She might have to worry about some other things like not having another career field to go into. For example, she might not have any interests. So that's something to consider as well. So I think if that's Amy's situation and she really wants to try, I would say go ahead and try it. And it might not be the answer that everybody wants to hear here, right? But at the same time, it's the logical answer. If you don't have anything to worry about financially, then maybe you give it a try. But we know that Amy, if she goes to art school, she doesn't have the financial resources to fall back on, it's going to be really risky. So if Amy is willing to take that risk and there are things that aren't important to her at this point in time, like, for example, building a family and owning a house and all these things that we want to achieve, then go ahead, try it. You can probably make it work. I think you can. You're probably not going to be a full-time artist, but you're going to be doing other things and you can make it work. But I would say on the other end of the spectrum, Amy, if you really want to do this, you don't have anything else to fall back on. And, I would probably consider another outlet that you could fall back on, another career field you could fall back in case this doesn't work out. So one of the big, I think, and this came from a paper, but also in the book, one of the things I talk about is, interestingly, we see artists who get BA degrees as opposed to BFA degrees earn more over the course of their lifetime than artists, right? So they're still identifying as artists. They may be different types of artists, but if you go to school and you get a BA in economics, you can still be an artist. There's nothing to say that you can't be, right? But if you go to school and get a BFA in painting, there's very little you can do with that. And I know there's going to be some reactions to me saying that, but there's a lot less you can do with that than you can do with getting a BA in economics. So just in terms of risk, I would probably lay it out for Amy and, have her consider the factors.
Well, I chose the BA in economics, and here I am as an amateur. Well, thank you very much. That was great. I think we were able to give our audience here a really good sense of what this book is about, and I'm sure there's a lot of anticipation for people who will want to get this in hand and actually read a copy. So I'm going to turn to questions. So do raise your hand if you have one, and I see Sunil has his hand up right there.
Always have to be peskily vocal on the chat. Sorry, but I really, really enjoyed this. I just, in the series in general, thanks, Michael and Joanna. I just was wondering, and maybe this is a predictable question as the research person at one of the research people at the NEA, but did you come up with or land on any recommendations, either implicit or overt recommendations about data infrastructure, the kinds of data that are not being collected, and is there any urgency? Like, I guess along the continuum of change that could be made with data infrastructure and or data collection techniques, such as one-off surveys or even other means of collecting or analyzing data. Were there any was it kind of, do you have suggestions for either a more radical or revolutionary kind of perspective of data changes, and or is it more kind of incremental changes working within the infrastructure, if you know what I mean? Because I think we know there are some, depending on these definitional issues which Michael raised at the beginning, there really is a spectrum of the kinds of changes that could be aspired for.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if you ended up on that sort of incremental changes that could be made, or more radical perspective on that.
I mean, I think, Sunil, you probably know that, right? You know this, that the biggest data limitation we have for understanding artistic work is that we don't see a lot of information about people's secondary occupations, right? So in the census data, for example, we have people identify their primary occupations based on the amount of time they spend in their occupation. But if they spend more time working in office or as a teacher than they do as an artist, we're going to see them show up as a teacher. Or Michael's not going to show up as a guitar player, right? He's not going to show up as a musician in the data. So that's, I think, one of the major data limitations. I make this assumption in the book that with respect to understanding how artistic work gets created, looking at the census data is actually really informative, right? So if we don't think about if we assume that artistic work gets created sort of consistently across different demographic groups, different types of people who go into the arts, then we can actually learn a lot from the census data. But if we're really interested in the types of people who choose artist occupations, then we actually can't learn a lot from the census data. So I would say the biggest improvement to the data infrastructure would be getting more information on secondary occupations to sort of understand the behavior of artists who aren't showing up in the data.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joanna. We have a question in the comment thread from Emily Zars. Do you look at how to support artists who are also caregivers?
It's not something that I have data on, so I'm not able to look at it. But it's absolutely a part of the policy discussion. And I think going back to some of Michael's questions about how the artist policy discussion actually, by and large, should, and I think is a very good idea, be integrated in broader policy discussions. That would be a great example of an area. I mean, we have a lot of policy discussion right now in this country about caregivers, obviously having parental leave, all these types of issues that come up around workers altogether. And I think artists would just be a part of that, as opposed to having it be a separate policy issue dealing specifically with artists.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Eric Ashby. Eric, you go ahead.
Thanks so much. Good. Thanks so much for the conversation. This has been awesome. I'm curious how philanthropy intersects with some of these discussions. One of the areas that strikes me as unique to artists as gig economy workers is that I can apply for an individual grant for $5,000 from the Indie Arts Council, and there's a lot of other gig workers that's not an option. And so I'm wondering if you address that in the book. And then as a follow-up to that, one of the things I know that I've seen as a problem in the policy landscape is you give someone $5,000, but they're accessing certain social safety net benefits, and then it unclassifies them for certain things that they were eligible for a grant that they received. So feels like there are some exceptional need or different considerations in that respect. So I'm wondering if do you discuss that at all, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I use this term policy, but I don't use it to mean only, governmental level policy. When I use the word policy, I think about policies and programs around supporting artists. And as we know, philanthropy is a very large source of the support that individual artists have in this country, and actually across the world. So I think I talk really broadly about that. So I think, did that answer your first question? Yeah, your second question is honestly a broader policy question, again, which is not only having to do with artists, but and actually I would disagree with you on one piece that you just said, which is there are a lot of other occupations that philanthropy supports, for example, entrepreneurs. There are a ton of foundations who have specific grant programs for entrepreneurs. And actually, I make the alignment between artists and entrepreneurs throughout the book, not because I actually think they're similar. I know that there are a lot of arguments that artists and entrepreneurs are similar, but I think entrepreneurship policy is actually a really good area of policy to draw from in order to understand how to support a specific sector of the workforce. There is an approach to entrepreneurship policy that has to do with not only increasing the number of entrepreneurs, which I don't know if we necessarily want to do for artists, but improving the quality of the work. And interestingly, in entrepreneurship policy, the focus is not on the individual entrepreneur. It's on businesses, it's on firms. And the alignment that I make to artist policy is that we focus so much on individuals that we forget what we're trying to do from a larger societal impact. And if we which is why I argue for networks and collaborations to be the primary focus of artist policy in the book. I think if we can take a little bit of what we learned from entrepreneurship policy and apply it there. So I'd also say in response to your question that policy towards specific occupations in federal level policy is actually really rare. We rarely see the government say, obviously we do sometimes, nurses, STEM workers, manufacturers, but in general, it's actually kind of exceptional that artists have even shown up in federal level policy. I mean, the fact that we had the WPA and the Federal Artists Project at some point in history all around a specific occupation is actually pretty remarkable. So I think, in that respect, artists have made a lot of progress on a governmental policy level. So I think your last question, though, that's a broader policy question to me, because there's a lot of different programs that as an occupation you can apply to get money, which will make you then not eligible for other types of programs. And it's this, right, it's a constant issue that we're trying to grapple with in terms of providing public assistance and subsidy. So I think, again, like as much as we can integrate artist policy in these broader discussions, that would probably help that issue as well.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. We have a question from Carol Rosenstein in the chat, and sort of a multi-part one. The United States does not have a very extensive sort of welfare state safety net. If that were extended in terms of policies towards housing, education, health insurance, childcare, old age care, would that reduce the risk in becoming an artist? Think of what you said to Amy. And also, in a comparative perspective, if we look at other countries that do have a more extensive welfare state, do we see more artists? Do we see, slightly different question, better art?
Such a good question, Carol. So for your first question, yes, I think we would see that would reduce the risk. And we can look across the world at places like Switzerland, for example, that higher ed is really cheap. So you can go and get an arts degree for the same amount, it's the same cost, many times free, as you can go and get an economics degree. So it makes it a lot easier for artists to train, right? Eventually sort of start careers. So I think broader, and we know also from the data, and this is actually coming from another project, that many of the artists that many people who identify as artists are actually not on public welfare assistance. And so there's this gap between those who are and who are not, and who are trying to make ends meet. And so we know that from another study we're doing right now with evaluating the artists in the guaranteed income program for New York State. So I think that, yes, that would eliminate some of the risk. Now, the second part of the question, though, is a really important part, is if we eliminated the risk, would we ultimately see more artists and better art? That's the part that my gut, and I think what I know about economics, is saying that we actually wouldn't. So if you look across so the United States is incredibly powerful in terms of the types of artistic work that we produce. So everybody knows who American artists are. So we think about the Hollywood industry, we think about some of the major contemporary artists of our time. Many of them are American. And there's I think a good reason for that is because it is really, we have a and this is again, like the economist in me, we have a decentralized way of organizing production. And when you look at other countries, right, where, for example, Switzerland, it has a pretty booming film industry. However, I spent some time in Switzerland and I talked to a lot of the philanthropists who fund the film industry in Switzerland. They said that even at our major Swiss film festivals, the American films are the ones that everybody pays attention to. Like, we'll have some Swiss films in there, but it's the American films that really are the ones that that have the impact, that are known across the world. So if we just take that as evidence, I think that my gut is saying that if we provided subsidy, we wouldn't necessarily get better art. And it's what a lot of people want to believe, but I think in reality, that's not what would happen.
Okay. Attila, you've had your hand up for a while. Go to your question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just want to say that it's really nice to see, and I'm really happy for this book and for this conversation. I'm researching design communication, and actually I arrived to the US like some weeks ago, and I'm really happy to almost immediately when we came here and see this conversation and such a great community. So I'm really happy for this book and this approach. And I already had a good conversation with Professor Noonan, and I have to say thank for Professor Gar Mills as well to be here. And my question is, for you is that how would you describe or are you describing gig life and this gig economy as especially for artists, and what are the differences? For example, if you are a painter, an exhibition considered a gig. If you are a stand-up comedian, a gig is a gig. But what are the differences here? And even if it's not that much different, policy making maybe make it differently.
Yeah. Well, I do think that there are differences for artists as gig workers than maybe other forms of gig workers. And that's even been seen in public policy already. So like the California gig worker law that had to go back and amend the law. Basically, there was a law that was created in California that firms had to classify employees in a certain way so that they were less likely to classify employees as independent contractors, and then more likely, obviously, to provide them with social benefits and employment benefits. But there was a pushback among the artist community saying that, we rely on gig work. So we don't want, if you make employees categorize us as employees, we're going to lose access to jobs. So the California government went back and said, okay, we're going to have some exclusions for these different types of workers, and many artists were included. So I actually do think that there's a fair amount of difference. You can find a lot of differences, and that needs to be taken into account from a policy standpoint. The second question you ask is, among the different types of artists, are there different ways that, gig artists work? And yes, absolutely. I mean, so a big aspect of how artists work is not the jobs that they take, but the preparation for the jobs that they ultimately take, right? So the rehearsing and the painting. So many visual artists are not painting on commission, they're painting in their studios and then eventually selling something. So that is, in my opinion, though, not necessarily an issue of gig work. That's an issue of that gets into other issues like tax policy, for example, what artists they are able to deduct on their taxes in terms of the work that they put in and the work that and the money that they ultimately receive from selling their work. So I think, yes, to answer your question, there are different forms of gig work, but at the same time, not all of it, the different ways that artists work also interact with different types of policies we have to think about as a field as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Hey, Doug, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, okay. So a lot of the talk between Michael and Joanna at the beginning of this half hour, I think, was framed around sort of work and transactions in a marketplace and artists doing this. And we've had these conversations, and I gotta be careful what kind of shorthand I use here. But if we were to think along a continuum of artistic work and productivity being more commercial or transactional on one end, and then arguably a lot of artwork that's ostensibly opposed to anyone appreciating it or paying for it, if not indifferent to that kind of outcome and that sort of artwork and the support of that. And I'm curious how you or your book speak to that element of the artistic practice and community and workforce that is non-commercial. And both from a, how would you advise Amy, who wants to be doing paintings that are so uninteresting, unlike the occupational therapist, who's probably not out there performing occupational therapy in ways that aren't being remunerated. That would be weird. But also how we think about that differently from policy, sort of from the worker and advising perspective, also then how policy might handle that.
So such a good question. And I actually wish I could focus on this more in the book. But I kind of had to make a concerted decision not to, because it would be a much longer book. And to be honest, I hate writing books. But I do have an answer for this because, so I specifically chose, when I think about the book, I specifically chose to focus on how artists build careers. And by that, I mean, sort of a really specific form of, how artistic work is being deployed, right? So this is for the purpose of actually having a job and then, being employed and et cetera. So that is probably what my book focuses on more. But in the beginning of the book, I have an introduction, and actually I feel like the most interesting part of the book is the introduction, because I was able to just like riff on things that I think about a lot, but I didn't really find ways to integrate it in the book's chapters. One of the things I talk about is like, there are certain types of people who even think about the possibility of being an artist, right? Like it likely, and we know this from research, if you have at all any exposure to the arts when you're growing up in school from your parents, you can think of Nepo babies, like that's the new term, right? Like these are people who have been told in a way through symbolism or through different types of signals that an artistic career is attainable. So somebody who grows up with an actor as a parent, two actors as a parent, they ultimately think that this is something they can do. So they engage in the process of creative activity throughout their entire lives and eventually go into it as a career. So I don't address so I think this halfway gets at your question, which is I don't necessarily address how to think about whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing to just make sure that people have the opportunity to engage in the arts. But I do address that when you do have the opportunity, especially at a very young age, to engage in the arts and it's just part of your life, then you're much more likely to have the motivation and the confidence and the self-assurance to go into an artistic career. And that's actually not true for just an artistic career. It's true for all careers. And I think we know that actually from the literature. Like there's a lot of studies that say, as when little kids are little and they have a role model that does a certain thing, they're much more likely to think that they can do it. So it's the same thing, I think, in the arts. So I think I partly get at your question, but not fully in the book. But I can get at it in one of our other conversations.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. Hannah has her hand up.
Hi, so this might relate to the previous question, also Carol's, but your framing of people having the right to choose an occupation is really interesting. What I think that can get mixed up with is that people then feel like they have a right to earn a full living at that. That gets really mixed up. I might like to be an astronaut, but I can't. Or lots of people want to do things that they can't earn a living at. So how do you think about that in terms of this? Thanks.
Well, I make it a really clear point in the book when I discuss it that just because you have the right to choose an occupation, I'm flipping through the book right now, doesn't mean that there is the expectation that you're going to make a living at it. So I think, you know, with respect to anybody who chooses an occupation, everything is a risk. So we choose something, we want to do it, it might not work out. I chose to be a professor. It was also a really hard market. There are hardly any jobs, right? Especially tenure track jobs, especially in the arts. And I did not choose to be an artist. I didn't want to actually, I didn't want to risk that as an artist. So I went to another really risky field instead. But I don't think that argument that I make is at all connected to the argument that there's also the expectation that the choice of occupation that you'll have is necessarily guaranteed to provide a living. And I can get into a little bit more of that, but and there's a lot of philosophical sort of logic, and I'm not a philosopher, but I do at least reference some philosophers in the book that talks about the separation between the two in a much more sort of clever way than I could do it right now.
Okay, I can't let a workshop go by without mentioning Rawls, and of course it's a very Rawlsian
you.
idea
Yeah.
you're giving here, in that his definition of equity involves this sort of equity in terms of opportunity to at least try for a particular office or a particular occupation, but no guarantee of success in those things. And so at least from a starting point, we have that kind of equity there.
Yeah.
Any further questions? We are almost at time, but I'm looking to the audience here. One thing Ben raises is teaching, and this is a thing I'm not sure I picked up much of the book, but how many people get training in the arts who go into high school or college teaching in that respect? And then I'm going to let Amy ask a question as well.
So
Actually,
I do have.
Yeah, you go ahead, Joanne.
Yeah, I do have a table in the book that does talk about higher education and the industries that artists go in. And interestingly, I think it's the second most common industry that artists end up going into if they identify as an artist as an occupation. The first is like professional management and scientific services. And then the third is information. So a lot of our artists are now going, obviously because of the internet and the digital sphere and stuff like that. So, but yeah, that's a huge industry that we see artists going into.
Okay, so very importantly, Amy, and I see you've had a flourishing career.
I just, I'm so excited for this book, and I'm sorry to be so late and to make a comment. Part of why I'm late is that I traveled back late last night from an exhibition that just opened at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford. And forgive me if this has already come up in this talk.
I saw this. It hasn't, but I just saw this. Yeah.
So the curator of this show, Veronica Roberts, is one of my oldest friends, and she's been working on that show for about 15 years, and it's called Day Jobs, and it's about artists' jobs and how the jobs had an impact on their work.
Yeah.
So there's a catalog for it. It's being shipped right now. It'll be out in a couple of months, and it's mostly essays by the artist. So I think for people in the audience who are ethnographers and coming at this from sociology, and just because it's the wonderful Stanford series that you're publishing in, I think that show would be really interesting. It's a magnificent piece of work, the show, and it's a kind of information we almost never have about artists. And the only reason we have it is because Veronica and some of her curator friends have been going on studio visits for 15 years and sharing information with each other. So like, for example, Jeffrey Gibson worked as a window display merchandiser at IKEA. There are people who are nannies in a way that impacted their work. There's a guy, Jim Campbell, who developed high def television and made work about the frontier of low definition. I mean, and I just think what you said really resonates for me. And, Doug, thanks for name checking Rawls. The idea that you can choose an occupation is also philosophically very similar to the conversations which also stem from Rawls about universal basic income, which I know you're working on with a different hat. But that show, and if you're at Stanford seeing that show, for anyone, I cannot say strongly enough like what a deep resonant body of work it is, and a political gesture of centering artists and art and looking at labor as part of art history, which I just think kind of meets this conversation in the middle. So
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks for
Amy.
letting me do that.
I saw that and I really want to see it. I just will note too, there's a piece of this book that I talk about multiple job holding, and I make a point to say it's not always the artist, the actor working, as a waiter or something like we have a lot of artists who are working day jobs who are actually integrating that work with their artistic work. And so there's different ways to look at this. So I will definitely check that out if I can. Thank you,
And
Amy.
they excluded teachers from the show because it's
Yeah.
so common to teach. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like Howardina Pindell teaches, but it's about her other jobs. So
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
Michael's point.
Thanks, Amy.
Okay, well, we're at time. This has been a great Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thank you, Joanna, for doing all this work. Just to clarify, this is not a book in publication yet. This is, and I know you're probably taking some of the questions you took here for further edits before we get the final product, but we'll be sure through the center and elsewhere to announce widely when the book is available. But I'd like to thank everybody for participating. We will see you again in 2 weeks. And thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, and thank you, everybody. The book should be out by the end of the year, and I'm happy to hear more from you. Just look me up online, and I really appreciate all of your comments because it is still a work in progress. So thank you again.
Okay, thanks, everybody.
Joanna, everyone.